Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. What she's saying in that third section is that traditional moral theory has thought of things in these terms, with two poles. Pole of the self or the individual, and the pole of the everybody else, the universal. And sometimes, like if you take Kant, for example, what does Kant say? You have to be able to universalize what it is that you're saying you ought to do. And if you can't universalize it, then it's not really a duty for you. You can't make it a duty. If you can universalize it and you can will it to be a universal law, then it tells you what your actual duty is. What is standing in the way of that? Your own selfishness, right? Your own tendency to make an exception for yourself. What about with Bentham? Greatest happiness principle, right? Greatest happiness of everybody. Egoism says, forget the whole, how is it going to pan out best for me? You might even have certain understandings of virtue ethics that sort of just fit into this thing as well. What's in between the everybody and the just one person, the self? Well, this whole, what she calls a matrix of relationships. And she thinks that traditional moral theory has not looked closely enough at this and focused on this as it should have. So she says, between this the domain between the self as the ego, as the self-interested individual, and the universal, everyone others in general, there's something else that has been overlooked. And what is that? The intermediate realm, she calls this, of family relations. So family fits in there. What else fits in there? Friendships. Group ties, neighborhood, especially from the point of view of women, she says. All that's been overlooked. Yeah, there's something to that. Again, when we look at Aristotle, we'll see that Aristotle had some room in there for that. But, does Kant have anything like that? Does Bentham have anything like that? Not really. As a matter of fact, Bentham actually, when he was talking about benevolence, didn't he contrast a too narrow view of benevolence, only looking out for your own neighborhood, your own group, your own family, with a universal benevolence? So even when there's some acknowledgement of that, there's not enough acknowledgement, Held would be saying. How important is this area? Well, at the beginning of the semester, every time that I ask Marist students about, what really matters to you, where does your happiness lie, inevitably some of you say family or your friends. So you think, at least, men and women both, because the answers actually come almost equally from men and women, don't they? That this matrix of relationships is something that's particularly important for you. And you would want moral theory to be able to tell you why, or how to distinguish good relationships from bad relationships. So she says this region of what she calls particular others. It's a distinct domain where what can be seen to be artificial and problematic are the very egoistic self and the universal all others. This is where we really live, she thinks, in this domain. This is where we really find ourselves in our relationships with other people. It's kind of according to her, it's kind of an illusion to think that first we exist as isolated, atomistic, totally individual selves and only then find ourselves in relationships. And if you think about this for just a moment, is that true? How did you come to be in this world as a human being? A little baby. Mom and dad. So you have at least two people that you're related to, right? And that's the core of family. And did you choose mom and dad? That doesn't even make sense, does it? I mean, under what weird science fiction thing could we have like the little baby choosing, okay, I'm going to be born out of this family here or something like that? That doesn't work. That's contingent. You didn't choose that. And then with your mom and dad, did anything else come as part of the package that you didn't have control over?
Their relationships.
Their relationships with, like who?
Like everyone else around them, like the rest of the family, or maybe they're like friends that...
Yeah, their neighborhood. I mean, they settled down in one particular place. You grew up there, or maybe you traveled around because, your mom or dad had to move around. People you interacted with who you didn't even know who they were, and you probably got told they were uncles and aunts, and they actually weren't uncles or aunts or even cousins, All this sort of stuff piles up, and all that is taking place in this intermediate sphere. And that helps to make you what you are. This is where you come from. You don't come from just an isolated individual all by yourself. You come from a context. This sounds a lot like McIntyre, though, doesn't it? At the beginning of the semester. And that's a very important thing to look at. So she says, in the domain of particular others, the self is already constituted to an important degree by relations with others. You are, in this respect, your relations with other people. You become the way that you interact with other people. These relations may be much more salient and significant than the interests of any individual self in isolation. The others in the picture are not the all others or everyone of traditional moral theory. They're not what a universal point of view or a view from nowhere would provide. They're actual people who you are connected with in some way. Neighbors, suite mates, or roommates, hallmates, whatever it is that you live with here in the dorms. I'm not sure what your living setup is like. Friends of friends, family, sometimes you can't get away from. So what's the importance of this? Well, this relationship idea is key. And think about the way in which we view relationships. Are relationships valuable only because you've got two isolated people who then connect up with each other and they're each getting something out of it and the relationship will last so long as they do? Some relationships are like that, right? Business relationships. You don't want to get too friendly with the people that you're connected with business relationships because you might have to break it off if they become unprofitable or they screw you over. But is that any way to look at, say, familial relationships? Is that the way a family relationship ought to go? Where anybody can say, I don't like this deal, I'm going to walk away. The family relationship comes to take on, ideally in this, a sort of importance of itself, where the people find themselves in the relationship. The relationship is not just about what each of them is getting out of it. The relationship becomes something that has its own value in the ethics of care, an intrinsic value. So she says self-development apart from their relation may be much less important than the satisfactory development of their relation. Think about a really good friendship. You don't measure a really good friendship just by what you yourself get out of it and what the other person gets out of it. There's something in the friendship that goes beyond the two of you and brings the two of you together. The friendship itself, developing that, maintaining it, deepening it, that becomes something valuable for its own sake, not just for the sake of what you yourself get out of it. That's part of why we can get so hurt when we think we're in that kind of relationship, and it turns out that the other person has only been looking at it instrumentally. That's why we feel so betrayed when somebody else, says, I'm going to use this for something else. she's on to something very important here. The ethics of care has something key to tell us. How can we evaluate relationships? She gives us some examples. Relationships can be evaluated as trusting or mistrustful. Not all relationships are good relationships, right? Mutually considerate or selfish. Some relationships, good relationships, are mutually considerate. Bad relationships, one person is getting taken advantage of. Harmonious or stressful. Now, of course, you might like stressful relationships. You know, some people actually enjoy conflict, but most of us don't, do we? Most of us would prefer to have harmonious relationships. I know some people who have relationships for the sake of having conflict that they like to have in their life, but I don't think that's most of us. Where trust and consideration are appropriate, she says, which is not always, we can find ways to foster them. But understanding and evaluating relationships requires us to look at relationships between actual persons, to have models that we can look to have criteria that's coming from the relationships that we experience. So here's the conclusion she draws. To be adequate, moral theories must pay attention to the neglected realm of particular others in the actual relations and actual context of women's experience. Again, she's mainly just talking about women's experience. But I think we could actually broaden this when it comes to the ethics of care. First off, let me ask you, do you think she's on to something? Do you think that she's right, that this is something really important for moral theory? Is that something that you would want an ethics class to tell you about? To come out of the class with some better insight into these relationships that you have than you came in with? If you say yes, then you agree with her. Not only that this is important, but that moral theory ought to focus on this. So I guess that'll be a test for this class, not for you to take, but for, when I give you the evaluations for the class. Moral theory must pay attention to this and to the actual context of women's experience. She gives a few examples of this later on, and I'm only going to focus on one of them. A different concept of the self. She says, there's a way of thinking about selves, again, where the relationship itself has the primary value and the people in the relationship find themselves in it. She says this happens in mother-child interaction and are satisfied in mutually empathetic relations. This doesn't require a loss of self, but a relationship of what she's calling mutuality, in which both self and other express intersubjectivity, both give and take in a way that not only contributes to the satisfaction of their needs as individuals, which is one thing, right? If I'm in a relationship with you, I should give and I should take in a way that fosters your good, that helps you out. And I should also look out for my own good too, right? It shouldn't just be giving all the time. I should also get something out of it. But also affirms the larger relational unit that they compose. Maintaining this larger relational unit then becomes a goal. So this is, when people talk in other terms, not about larger relational units, but when they say our friendship matters, or family matters, or if you're involved in a romantic relationship, people then talk in terms of relationship. I'm concerned about our relationship. They don't just say, I'm concerned about me and I'm concerned about you. They talk about, I'm concerned about this thing that connects us together, the health of the relationship, the longevity of it, whether it's a good relationship or not. That has to become an explicit goal in moral theory held things. And then she says maturity is seen not in terms of individual autonomy, just being able to, direct yourself, call your own shots, but in terms of competence in creating and sustaining relations of empathy and mutual intersubjectivity. Mutual intersubjectivity, that's kind of a complicated thing, but just think about empathy. Think about experiences that you've had where, I think all of you have had, we'll just take professors, right? I'm willing to bet that every one of you has had a class that has given you trouble. Is that accurate? Maybe more than one? Okay. Do you go to the person's office hours or talk with them or something like that? So if a professor is actually empathetic towards you, what does that look like? Does that mean they just say, oh, whatever you need? They're sort of a pushover? That's not empathy. What does it look like? Yeah.
they don't like tell you what to do, they kind of work with you to make it, like they're guiding you, not just showing you, kind of.
That's a good way to put it. They work with you. There's a recognition of the value of you as a person in doing that, right? And there is some sense of allowing you autonomy, but it's trying to work towards your own good, your flourishing, treating you as a person, as valuable.
Like they're not trying to belittle you, they know that you're capable of doing it, and
Yeah.
they're just trying to point in the right direction.
Yeah, and they also, can they tell anything about the trouble that you're having? They don't dislike you because you're not understanding their great subject that everyone ought to be studying or something like that. They understand the difficulties that you're having with it. And they have some sort of, not necessarily having the same feelings as you, but you can tell that they understand your feelings. That's what empathy actually is. That's something that takes, like she says, competence. You have to develop that. It's not something that automatically comes to you in every case. Maturity, from this point of view, the ethics of care, would mean having the capacity within this realm of relationships of developing empathy, developing care for other people. When it comes to emotions, the two emotions that ethics of care is most concerned about is care, and then this whatever it is that we call empathy. We might not necessarily see it as an emotion, but an emotional capacity. So that's where we'll leave off.